England's captain that day was George Hearn. He would find himself in the unenviable position of needing to reorder a batting lineup who were anxious to avoid facing up to the frightening craft of an until then unknown opening bowler. One of these awaiting batsmen, William Brockwell, perhaps not the bravest soul ever to tour these lands, left the ground entirely, citing sudden and urgent business which needed attention. He returned, coyly I imagine, only after the last ball of the day had been bowled. The year was 1892, Newlands Cricket Ground, Cape Town. And the man inflicting this terror was Hendrix. He had grown up on the slopes of Signal Hill overlooking Cape Town. Described as a red-hot trundler, he was 6'2", express, deadly accurate, and frustratingly for George Hearn, he could bowl all day. He was the best bowler England encountered on their tour. Walter Reid, the tour captain, described him as South Africa's Fred Stofforth, a champion Australian, credited with inventing swing bowling, and perhaps a clue as to the origin of Crom's curious nickname. He believed Hendrix would be a major drawcard on South Africa's scheduled tour to England 2 years later in 1894. However, Hendrix never went on that tour. His initial inclusion in the squad was subsequently vetoed by the convener of selectors, William Middleton. For having consulted his close associate and tour funder, Cecil John Rhodes, Crom's selection was considered impolitic. For there was one absurd observation: he wasn't white. Race-divided politics had been gaining new traction since the discovery of diamonds and gold to the north, but it remained unclear as to how these types of policies might be applied to something like the brand new concept of international sport. Until now. For in Hendrix there was precedent, a wretched one which would come to apply across sporting codes and multiple generations. Indeed, Hendrix was not only excluded from the 1894 touring team, but in the short years that followed, he was also systematically removed from provincial and then club cricket at the hands of William Middleton and, to quote Drew Forrest, a determined band of bigots. Hendrix now falls off the register. There is almost no record of his life from this point, anonymous in his injustice. By contrast, William Middleton's association to Cecil John Rhodes would see him subsequently appointed as the administrator for the whole of southern Rhodesia. Opportunity and skin colour were displaying a patent correlation. And this correlation would tighten still further 2 generations later with the election of the National Party in 1948 under its banner of Apartheid. That very year, England was again touring South Africa, this time under the captaincy of George Mann. Commentating for the BBC on that tour was John Arlott. Arlott would go on to cover every England home test between the war and 1980. He was England's voice of summer, and his great love of poetry saw him treat the game of cricket as a worthy sideshow to the more fascinating characters, hats, teacups, and seagulls which he painted with his prose. In the 5th test, when the England captain was bowled by his namesake Tufty Man, Arlott could not resist, describing that moment as a case of man's inhumanity to man. His partnership with fellow commentator Brian Johnson was legendary. Johnson provided the life, Arnott the soul, observed Paul Cooper. But it was exactly 10 years after that 1948 tour that John Arlott would receive an obscure letter penned in green ink from the address 14 Upper Bloom Street, Cape Town. It was written by a South African cricketer, then unknown to Arlott. His name was Basil D'Oliveira. He had been mesmerized by Arlott's commentary, and he had felt the soul. He had a warm, trusted voice that made everything all right in the world, wrote D'Oliveira. Like Hendrix 2 generations before, D'Oliveira had grown up on Signal Hill. But he also just happened to have the same skin color. And so D'Oliveira was legally classified by the Apartheid government as being colored. Although given the Hendrix precedent as a cricketer, well, there may as well have been just 2 classifications, white and those who don't qualify. Basil had learnt his cricket on the streets before joining his father's club, St. Augustine's, a proud institution which was then already half a century old. There was no coaching, facilities were poor, matting wickets, and an uneven field which was shared by some 25 teams. Third slip in one game and square leg in another could discuss the morning paper. But there was plenty of pride and passion. This was free and aggressive cricket. That said, D'Oliveira's father had been a stern man who treated cricket as a very serious pursuit. As such, young Basil was infused with that enviable combination of both mental toughness and a free-flowing aggressive instinct. This, together with unquestionable talent, he put to use in accumulating an extraordinary club record, a career average of over 100, including more than 50 centuries. He had entered folklore by bludgeoning 46 runs in a single 8-ball over, and he once contributed 225 out of a total team score of 236. His ball striking was legendary. But he had also taken wickets by the bagful and carried best figures of 9 for 2. There was magic in these numbers. When England returned to South Africa in 1956, a 25-year-old D'Oliveira was now watching closely from the separate coloured enclosure at Newlands. With no opportunities for further progression in South Africa, he began to wonder whether perhaps there might be an option to play in England. It was something of a pipe dream, but 2 years later in 1958, he nonetheless decided to do something about it. This was the speculative green-inked letter to John Arlott. To Arlott's credit, considering the obscurity of its author, he took it upon himself to investigate further, learning in the process of D'Oliveira's magical record, and then putting his feelers out to clubs across England. But for 2 years, nothing. D'Oliveira had no first-class record, no comparable stake against which to measure him. But then came a freak moment of fortune. Middleton Cricket Club in the Central Lancashire League had been looking to sign the West Indian quick Wes Hall. Hall was, however, struggling to juggle his international duties, and by the time that he did finally decline the offer, the club was so desperate it was prepared to take a gamble. "Dear Basil D'Oliveira," wrote John Arlott on January 26, 1960. "Now I have an offer for you to play as a professional in England this summer." The money was uninspiring, insufficient even to cover both the airfare and living expenses, but news of the offer immediately rallied the Cape Town cricketing community. "How can I thank those people of all creeds and colours for defying the Apartheid laws to get me to England," wrote D'Oliveira, making specific reference to Gerald Innes, who had toured Australia under Jack Cheetham in 1951, but now organised a benefit game for D'Oliveira, after which the players walked around amongst the spectators with open hats in order to help get D'Oliveira to England. South Africa is a complex land. D'Oliveira left Cape Town on March 31, 1960. His angst heightened by the fact that Cape Town was in shutdown following Philip Gosana's extraordinary march from Langa just the day before. He left behind his new wife, Naomi, to whom he had been married just a matter of weeks, arriving in a damp foreign London on April 1st. A CNN account describes him struggling to exit Heathrow Airport as he could not locate the non-white exit. It would be a tough transition, notably to the damp green wickets and the freezing fingers associated with early season cricket up in Lancashire. And it showed. Per Wisden, he scored just 25 runs in his first 5 innings. D'Oliveira, by his own admission, carried an acute fear of returning back to his community as a failure. But with that came a deep-rooted desire to succeed. D'Oliveira was a fighter, an attribute which was helping him to turn the tide, and once he had adjusted to the conditions, he was immense, ending the season at the top of the league averages, just ahead of a 24-year-old Garfield Sobers. Added to that were 71 wickets at an average of less than 12. Middleton's gamble had paid off more than handsomely. Baz, or Dolly as he'd become known, was welcomed back for another season. This time he was accompanied by Naomi and their new baby, Damien. D'Oliveira broke 1,000 runs in that second season, which now saw him catching the attention of some major counties. However, that amazing record which D'Oliveira had been accumulating back in South Africa had come at a price, for he was now past his prime. To this day, there remain question marks about his age, which D'Oliveira occasionally understated, fearing the truth may have been career-limiting. most records have him born in 1931, which made him 34 years old when he did eventually make his first-class debut for Worcestershire in 1965. Comparable all-rounders like Gary Sobers and Andrew Flintoff had already retired from Test cricket by that age. But this never really mattered. D'Oliveira spoke with English willow. He made a century on his first-class debut against Essex before piling on 1,500 runs, helping to secure Worcestershire the coveted county championship. With that came inevitable interest from the England selectors. Hello Dolly, a popular West End musical which had premiered in 1963, was perhaps inevitably the newspaper headline when he was selected for England in 1966. Dolly was a popular selection. He was a popular man. Having arrived nervously in England as a teetotaler, he had found his confidence and quickly developed a reputation for enjoying his parties like his cricket in the longest possible form. His stories were gold and his love of life irresistible, observed Mark Nicholas. On the field, his aggressive approach and ball striking had captured the imagination of fans, as had his new, smart-looking cricket bat. It was handcrafted by his own Worcestershire teammate, an opening batsman who came from a line of Yorkshire woodworkers and cabinet makers, and whose bat-making skills were legendary. But perhaps more than that, with experience as a pattern maker, he had been pioneering with a move away from the old ink-stamped bats and was experimenting instead with stickers. Notably, a distinctive black triangle, the first 4,000 of which were hand-cut by his wife. They proved to be a phenomenon, and Duncan Fernley's bats, which Dolly was helping to spread through his vicious stroke play, emerged suddenly as the envy of every cricket-loving youngster in England. D'Oliveira performed strongly in his debut Test series against the West Indies. His maiden Test century came a year later in 1967, on his way to being one of Wisden's 5 cricketers of the year. This had been a meteoric rise, a fairy tale. Dolly's place in the Test team was now entrenched, as was his family in Worcester. But these developments were beginning to cause consternation 8,000 miles to the south. South African Prime Minister Hendrix, who, in a strange twist of fate, had attended Middleton School in Rhodesia, named after the man central to ending Crom Hendrix's international aspirations, had recently reiterated South Africa's stance on these matters by prohibiting Maori players from touring South Africa with the All Blacks in 1965. But Basil D'Oliveira, with his South African roots, presented the potential for even greater controversy, considering England's scheduled tour to South Africa in 1968. For they knew that D'Oliveira would have drawn massive interest in South Africa, a natural hero to all those excluded by the system. This was lining up to be South Africa's Jesse Owens moment. But first there was an Ashes series to be played. It did not start well for the home team in the opening test at Old Trafford, although D'Oliveira himself had top scored with an unbeaten 87 in what proved to be a losing cause for England. But it is at this moment that one enters a world of speculation and conspiracy. What is clear is that there were undefined forces which, for obvious political reasons, were trying to ensure that D'Oliveira did not sail to South Africa. Because following his top score, he was now dropped for the second test. Meanwhile, he was quietly offered a massive bribe by a South African businessman in return for making himself unavailable for the South African tour. D'Oliveira rejected it angrily. Meanwhile, in Dolly's absence, the next 3 tests were all drawn, leaving Australia 1-0 up in the series going into the final test. And with D'Oliveira out of form for Worcestershire, his return was looking unlikely. But just on the eve of that final test, Roger Prideaux pulled out with pleurisy, so opening the door for D'Oliveira's return. It all lines up like fiction. A poor performance in the final test may have provided a convenient basis for D'Oliveira's omission from the South African touring squad, which was due to be announced just days after that test. A strong performance would surely see him selected. And with D'Oliveira's ultimate dream being a tour back home to South Africa, this was to be the most important innings of his life, an opportunity to show some fight. His response was worthy of a great man. The author Peter Oborn describes it as the greatest innings ever played. No other innings in Test history, argues Oborn, has done anything like so much good. Those who rose in ovation to cheer him off the field could forever boast that they were there that day. Friday, August 23rd, 1968. The Oval, London. D'Oliveira had scored an incredible 158 runs, which had helped England square the series. Colin Cowdrey stated the obvious in the post-match interview: they can't leave Basil out of the team. Not now. Barrington, Boycott, Brown, Cartwright, Cottam, Cowdrey, Hendrix, Fletcher, Graveney. It took some time to process. D'Oliveira was out. He was listening from his Worcestershire change room, having just scored another 128. His first memory is that of his teammate Tom Graveney swearing bitterly in anger. D'Oliveira was overcome by emotion. His dream shattered. He well understood the context. This was politics, dirty and cruel. As he stepped out of the change room, his 8-year-old son Damien said, "Never mind, Dad, you're still the greatest." He wept heavily. That evening, he took Naomi out for dinner, slowly coming to terms with the fact that it was out of his hands. Despite the enormous pain, Basil D'Oliveira was to display exceptional dignity. But little did they know, even as they sat at dinner, the world around them was changing. A storm was brewing on Fleet Street, which would tear the MCC selectors to pieces at first light, a row which raged for weeks, spilling off the broadsheets and into the public theatre, even into the British Houses of Parliament. 19 members of the MCC resigned over his omission, and John Arlott refused to commentate against South Africa. There have been many strange decisions by England cricket selectors over the years, wrote Matthew Engel from The Guardian. Only one of them changed the world. Basil and Naomi now found themselves at the center of an international scandal, one which was inspiring deep political rifts. D'Oliveira was inevitably targeted by groups to make more aggressive political statements. However, D'Oliveira always resisted. He knew that, above all, he was a cricketer, whose political messages could best be expressed through the supreme authority of his Duncan Fearnley. Accordingly, he would always redirect political questions back to the game he loved, that he was simply striving to play cricket at the highest possible level. Although with some irony, this non-political approach would prove to be hugely effective politically, for it emphasized just how absurd it was that one's skin color could be a factor in what cricket one played. And while society had long been numbed by perpetual political wrangling, the D'Oliveira affair emerged instead as a human story, something people could relate to and through which they could share their own hero's pain. It served to expose the cruelty of the Apartheid system in a meaningful way. Indeed, for many ordinary Britons, it was the D'Oliveira affair above all which severed any remaining sympathy for their old colony. Meanwhile, back in South Africa, members of the ruling National Party in Congress at the time stood and cheered on hearing of D'Oliveira's omission. This is where it all gets interesting, because news of this celebration would filter back into England, and it left a sour taste, most notably for Tom Cartwright, the man who had been selected in place of D'Oliveira. When I read that, I went cold, and I started to wonder whether I wanted to be part of it. Cartwright now pulled out of the tour. He cited injury, but this was a Gorgadebe moment, one of those gooseflesh-inducing moments of self-sacrifice which human beings are occasionally capable of. Dolly was back on the tour. Again, it was dinner with Naomi, but this time at the Plymouth Hotel, and this time in celebration. It proved to be premature, because the new South African Prime Minister B.J. Vorster managed the whole bungled process in the great tradition of politics, by twisting it. The team as constituted now, bellowed Vorster in reference to the late inclusion of D'Oliveira, is not the team of the MCC, but the team of the anti-apartheid movement. South Africa called off the tour. D'Oliveira's great dream was over, but in the process, the relationship between the British people and South Africa had been forever changed. Apartheid was no longer tolerated. A shift in attitude, perhaps best evidenced by the birth of a baby boy just a few short miles from Middleton Cricket Club at the beginning of that fateful 1968 season. Because the next time these two teams met one another in a test match, 26 years later, South Africa was a democracy. And that baby boy from Lancashire was captaining England, a generation lost. D'Oliveira's response to the affair would seal his legacy, for he picked himself up and without breathing a word about his loss, he set about making the most of what was being denied to so many: opportunity. When he did finally retire from Test cricket 4 years later in 1972, he was 41 years old, 44 according to some records. Here was a man of immense talent, fighting spirit, and zest for life. He played first-class cricket until he was almost 50. His son Damien, born, you'll remember, in 1960, grew up watching cricket at New Road, Worcester. He too developed into a fine cricketer, playing for Worcestershire and winning 2 championships alongside Ian Botham and Graham Hick, all of whom added yet more lustre to Worcester's now world-famous batmaker Duncan Fearnley. Fearnley turned 80 last month. They are still producing bats from his workshop in Worcester, the last of a breed to reject mass production and instead use generations of accumulated skill and feel to handcraft the Rolls-Royce of cricket bats. Fearnley is an old friend of South Africa. Back in 1983, he shipped £250,000 worth of equipment to South African townships in order to help support the game there. Gerald Innes, the man who had organised the benefit game to fund D'Oliveira initially, died sadly of cancer back in 1982. He was just 50 years old. He would have no doubt followed D'Oliveira's career with great satisfaction. John Arlott lived to see South Africa take its first tentative steps into democracy. D'Oliveira's success and his own role in it had, in his words, given me one of the greatest feelings of joy from any episode in my life. He passed away in 1991, aged 77. Basil D'Oliveira, CBE, was listed as one of South Africa's 10 cricketers of the century. He lived to see England and South Africa begin playing for the D'Oliveira Trophy in 2004, a trophy and a story worthy of what has become one of the great rivalries in cricket. D'Oliveira deserves every bit of this recognition, but in his success lies a tangible reminder of generations lost. From Crom Hendrix through to Duke Arbid, Ben Malamba, Saeed Majid, Eric Peterson, far too many to list. D'Oliveira himself acknowledged that in amongst those 25 teams sharing an uneven field in the 1950s, there were players more talented than himself. It is our duty as a nation to discover and to nurture this talent. Today, it is his grandson, Brett, who plays under the D'Oliveira stand at New Road, a third-generation Worcestershire player. He is also a fourth-generation St Augustine's player, having followed in the footsteps of his great-grandfathers by contributing to the fine traditions of that now 120-year-old institution. Basil D'Oliveira passed away in 2011. He was 80 years old, well, maybe a little older, a great man, a man of great dignity. Naomi lived 10 minutes from New Road until very recently. She passed away in 2018. Hello Dolly returns to London's West End in August 2020.